At a rock shelter called Sibudu, 20 miles north of the Indian Ocean coast in what is now South Africa, archaeologists working under Lynn Wadley of the University of the Witwatersrand uncovered something in the sediment that should not have been possible to preserve for 77,000 years. They found bedding, layered grass bedding, pressed flat by the weight of sleeping bodies, sealed beneath ash, and beside that bedding the remains of small hearths kept burning through the night. The hearths had been tended. Someone had risen in the dark to feed them. Someone had lain down again. And then, hours later, someone else had risen, and the pattern repeated again and again, across seasons and generations, until the floor of that shelter held a record of how human beings actually slept before electric light, before clocks, before the modern insistence that a body must lie unbroken for 8 hours to be considered well. The bones found inside that shelter, and inside dozens of others like it, tell a story modern medicine is only now catching up to. The female pelvises recovered from sites of this period carry signatures of interrupted rest. The inner ear bones, the small auditory ossicles preserved in the temporal region of the skull, show patterns of stress consistent with chronic light sleep alertness, and the wear on the molars of women from Natufian burial grounds in the Levant, dated between 14,000 and 11,000 years before the present, suggests jaw tension overnight, the kind of clenching the modern dentist diagnoses in a patient who never fully descends into deep sleep. These women were not sleeping the way we have been told a healthy body sleeps. They were sleeping in 2 halves, sometimes 3, divided by a wakeful interval their bodies treated as biologically normal. I want to ask you something before we go any further, and I want you to think about it honestly. Have you ever woken at 2 or 3 in the morning, fully alert, not anxious, just awake, and lain there for an hour, sometimes more, before sleep returned? Have you been told this is insomnia? Have you been told something is wrong? Because the evidence in the ground says something very different, and the older you are, the more clearly your body may be remembering a rhythm that is 80,000 years older than the 8-hour night. 80,000 years! That is more than 3,200 human generations, each one passing this rhythm to the next, every one of them sleeping in shifts because the night required it. The world they slept in was colder than ours. The Pleistocene Ice Age was still pressing down on the northern continents. Predators moved at night. Fires died if they were not fed, and the women in those shelters carried the watch. Chapter 1. The World After Dark. To understand why women slept in shifts for so much of human history, you must first stand inside the night they were sleeping through. It was not the night you know. The night you know is a softened thing, lit at its edges by street lamps and dashboard screens, warmed by central heating, secured behind locked doors and double-glazed windows. The night the women of the late Pleistocene and the early Holocene slept through was unlit beyond the reach of a single hearth, unheated beyond the radius of that flame, and entirely open at its edges to whatever moved in the dark. The Earth between 40,000 and 12,000 years ago was in the long final phase of the last glacial maximum, a period geologists divide into the marine isotope stage 3 and marine isotope stage 2. Mean global temperatures sat between 4 and 6 degrees Celsius below today's averages. Ice sheets 2 miles thick covered most of what is now Canada and northern Europe. The Sahara was a wetter grassland. The Mediterranean basin was cooler and drier. Sea levels were as much as 120 meters lower than they are now, which means coastlines we cannot see today were inhabited, and the people walking them looked up at constellations slightly shifted from the ones above us. In this world, a woman in a rock shelter in the Clayses River region of southern Africa, or in a cave at Lagavelho in what is now Portugal, or in a windbreak hut on the Russian plain at the Sungir site discovered by Otto Bader in 1955, slept with her family in a circular arrangement around a hearth no larger than a modern kitchen sink. The hearth was the heart of survival. It kept body temperature from collapsing through the cold hours when metabolic rate naturally falls. It deterred carnivores whose night vision was sharper than the human eye. It dried meat hung from low racks above the smoke. It served as the only artificial light on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years, and it required constant maintenance. A hearth left untended for more than 2 or 3 hours in a cold climate would die. A dead hearth meant a cold dawn, and a cold dawn at the wrong time of year could mean death by hypothermia for the youngest and the oldest in the group. Maintenance of the hearth was almost universally women's work. We know this from the patterns of skeletal wear preserved in female remains from the Pavlovian sites in what is now the Czech Republic, excavated systematically by Bohuslav Klima and later by Jiří Svoboda from the 1950s onward. The female skeletons from Dolní Věstonice and the nearby Pavlovy site, dated to between 29,000 and 25,000 years before the present, show repeated microfractures in the bones of the hands and forearms, consistent with the repeated grasping, lifting and feeding motions associated with fire maintenance. The same skeletons show wear patterns on the lumbar vertebrae consistent with prolonged squatting in front of low heat sources. The men of the same population show different wear patterns, more shoulder torque, more hip rotation, the signatures of throwing and walking long distances. The bodies record the division of labour without needing any written record to confirm it. So the women fed the fire. And because fires must be fed at intervals, and because no single human being can stay awake for the entire 8 to 10 hours of a Pleistocene winter night, the work was distributed across the female members of a band by age, by reproductive status, and by the natural variation in sleep timing that human biology already contained. Roger Kirch, the historian at Virginia Tech who first reconstructed the biphasic sleep pattern from European archival sources in his 2001 paper in the American Historical Review, has noted that the same pattern reaches back deep into prehistory because the conditions that produced it are deep prehistoric conditions. Cold, predators, children, fire. A woman who slept through every fire-feeding interval, every infant waking, every faint scratch at the edge of the shelter, would lose her line. A woman whose nervous system passed the night into 2 or 3 sleep periods, with brief awakenings between them, would keep her line alive. Across 3,000 human generations, the second design out-reproduced the first, and the second design is the one we carry. The shelters these women slept in were not the picturesque caves of children's books. Most habitation sites of the Upper Paleolithic in Eurasia were open-air encampments protected by windbreaks made of mammoth bone, wood and hide, or rock overhangs that provided shelter on only one side. At Mezhyrich, in what is now Ukraine, archaeologist Ivan Pidoplichko in 1965 excavated 4 circular dwellings built almost entirely from the bones of mammoths. 149 mandibles and tusks in a single structure, weighing more than 20 tons in total. The dwellings were occupied between 19,000 and 14,000 years ago, in the coldest centuries of the last glacial period. Inside each structure, a central hearth. Around each hearth, sleeping positions identified by the wear on the floor and by the positioning of personal ornaments dropped during the night. The interior temperature in a well-built mammoth bone dwelling, modelled by climate archaeologists at the Russian Academy of Sciences, would have hovered around 5 to 10 degrees Celsius even in the depth of winter. Survivable, but only if someone kept the central fire burning. This is the physical world of the chapter we have entered, a world of small, dim shelters in which the women lay down in the early evening, often by full dark, because there was nothing to do once the fire was banked and the children fed. We can estimate from the ethnographic record of contemporary forager societies, the work of Carol Worthman at Emory University, and of Gandhi Yetish and his colleagues at the University of New Mexico, whose 2015 paper in Current Biology measured sleep in 3 modern hunter-gatherer groups, that the typical sleep onset in such societies falls roughly 3¼ hours after sunset. In Pleistocene latitudes, in winter, sunset could fall at 4 in the afternoon. Sleep onset by 7 or 8 in the evening would have been normal, and total time in bed, counted from sleep onset to morning rise, would have stretched to 10 or even 11 hours. But total sleep itself, The actual hours spent unconscious would have run closer to 6.5 to 7. The difference between the 11 hours in bed and the 7 hours asleep is the wakeful interval that defines biphasic sleep. Inside that wakeful interval, the woman who had risen would have done specific things. She would have fed the hearth, perhaps adding 2 or 3 sticks of wood, perhaps blowing on the coals until they brightened. She would have checked the children, particularly any infant under the age of 2, who in the Pleistocene face mortality rates of close to 40% in the first year of life, a figure documented from the demographic reconstructions of Caroline van Sickle and her colleagues working on Neanderthal and early modern human remains. She would have urinated outside the shelter if it was safe to do so, or used a vessel near the doorway if it was not. She would have eaten a small amount, often dried meat or stored plant material, because the metabolic dip of the middle night produces a real hunger that the modern person has been trained to ignore. And she would have spoken, in low voices, to whichever other woman in the group happened to be awake during the same interval, because the shifts overlapped, and at any given moment in the night, at least 1 and sometimes 2 women in the band were conscious and watching. The evidence for this overlapping watch comes from an unexpected source: the soot deposits inside Pleistocene hearths. Hearths that are fed once at dusk and then left to die produce a characteristic single-layer ash deposit. Hearths that are fed in intervals through the night produce stratified ash, with thin bands of fresh charcoal alternating with finer ash from quieter intervals. The hearth analyses conducted by Christopher Miller and his colleagues at the University of Tübingen, working on micromorphology of hearth sediments at South African and European sites, have shown stratified hearths across nearly every Upper Paleolithic occupation level they have examined. The fires were not banked once and abandoned. They were tended in shifts. There is one more piece of physical evidence that closes Chapter 1 and sets the stage for what comes next. At the site of Ohalo II, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in modern Israel, excavated by Danny Nadell of the University of Haifa beginning in 1989, archaeologists found the remains of 6 brushwood huts dated to 23,000 years ago. The huts had been preserved by submersion in lake waters during a period of higher water levels and recovered only when modern drought lowered the lake again. Inside one of the huts, beneath a hearth, the team found the burial of an adult male, but the floor of the hut itself, the grass and brushwood that had served as bedding, was preserved in remarkable detail. The bedding had been laid in 2 distinct zones, on opposite sides of the central hearth, with a clear divide between them. The chemistry of the 2 zones differed. One showed higher concentrations of compounds associated with adult occupation. The other showed compounds associated with infants and small children. The hut had been organised for sleep in segments, and the segments suggest a sleeper who rose, attended to the children, and lay down again, perhaps in a different position. Nadell's team has not published this interpretation in those exact terms, but the layout speaks for itself. By the end of Chapter 1, you should be able to close your eyes and feel the inside of that hut. Smoke against the underside of the brushwood roof, cold air moving at floor level, the sound of breathing from 4 or 5 other bodies pressed close, the hearth at the centre glowing low, and a woman, perhaps in her 30s, perhaps in her 60s, sitting up partway through the night, her eyes adjusting to the dark, listening before she moved. This is not a metaphor. This is what the bones and the bedding and the soot and the chemistry of preserved hut floors all say. The night was divided, and the women divided it. The reason they divided it, the specific biological signature this work left on the female body, generation after generation, across the long pressure of the Pleistocene, is what Chapter 2 will now begin to uncover. Chapter 2: The Natufian Molars. The first place a researcher should look for evidence of how a body slept thousands of years ago is the teeth. Teeth survive when almost nothing else does. Enamel is the hardest substance the human body produces, harder than bone, harder than antler, and once it has been laid down during childhood it does not remodel itself the way bone does. Whatever stresses a tooth absorbs across a lifetime are stored permanently in the structure of its crown and root. And the stresses that overnight sleep produces on teeth, the tiny abrasions caused by jaw clenching, the microfractures caused by grinding, the wear patterns at the contact points between upper and lower molars are among the most diagnostically useful markers in all of paleopathology. The Natufian culture, which occupied the eastern Mediterranean coastlands between approximately 14,500 and 11,500 years before the present, has given us one of the richest collections of female skeletal material from any prehistoric population. The Natufians were the last hunter-gatherers of the Levant and the first people in the world to settle into permanent or semi-permanent villages before the invention of agriculture. Their burials were placed beneath the floors of their dwellings, often in shallow pits sealed with stone slabs, and the dry climate of the region preserved their remains with unusual completeness. The largest Natufian cemetery, at the site of Ainan Malaha, north of the Sea of Galilee, was excavated initially by Jean Perrot of the French Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique beginning in 1955 and continued for more than 50 years through teams led by François Vallin and others. The site yielded the remains of more than 100 individuals, and among the female remains, a pattern of dental wear that took researchers decades to interpret correctly. The pattern is this. The molars of Natufian women, particularly women estimated to be over the age of 30 at death, show a distinctive form of wear known in dental anthropology as nocturnal attritional facets. These are flat, polished surfaces on the chewing planes of the upper and lower molars that do not match the wear patterns produced by chewing food. They are oriented along axes consistent with the jaw movements that occur during sleep. They are most pronounced on the second and third molars, the teeth furthest back in the jaw, which are the teeth most stressed by night clenching, and they appear in the female Natufian population at rates substantially higher than in the male population. Veerda Shed of the Israel Antiquities Authority, working with Israel Hershkovitz of Tel Aviv University, published the most detailed analysis of these patterns in a 2010 study in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, examining 117 Natufian adults and noting that women showed nocturnal facet development at rates roughly 1.5 times those of men of similar estimated age. This is the first revelation. It is small, and at first glance it might seem like a minor curiosity of dental wear. But the implications are not small. What the molars are recording is sleep that does not fully release the muscles of the jaw. In deep sleep, the stage 3 of non-REM sleep, sometimes called slow-wave sleep, the muscles of the jaw relax completely. The mouth falls slightly open. Bruxism, the technical term for tooth grinding, does not occur during this deeper stage. Bruxism occurs predominantly during the lighter stages of non-REM sleep, stages 1 and 2, and during the brief micro-arousals that punctuate the transitions between sleep stages. A jaw that shows heavy nocturnal attritional facets across decades is a jaw that spent unusually large amounts of nighttime in the lighter stages of sleep. It is the jaw of a body that did not descend into the deepest sleep for long stretches, but instead cycled repeatedly through lighter stages with frequent micro-arousals. And this is precisely the pattern that biphasic and polyphasic sleep produce. A woman who sleeps from approximately 8 in the evening to midnight, wakes, attends to a child or a fire or a worry, then returns to sleep until perhaps 5 in the morning, will spend a much smaller proportion of her night in deep, slow-wave sleep than a woman who sleeps an unbroken 8-hour block. The micro-arousals at the boundaries of each sleep segment, the brief jaw tensions associated with returning consciousness, the light dozing that often follows a wakeful interval before full sleep resumes, all of these leave their mark on the molars over a lifetime, and the Natufian women, generation after generation, were leaving exactly this mark. The site of Ainan Malaha was not a peripheral one. The Natufians built circular semi-subterranean dwellings, dug a half-metre or so into the ground, with walls of stone and roofs supported by wooden posts. The hearths were central, the burials beneath the floors. The dwellings were occupied in cold seasons and sometimes year-round, and the population density of these proto-villages, estimates suggest between 50 and 150 individuals per settlement, was higher than anything that had come before in human history. With higher density came new sleep pressures. The crying of one child could wake an entire settlement. The hostility of a neighbour, the proximity of stored food that attracted rodents and the occasional predator, the noise of livestock in later phases of the Natufian, all of these added layers of acoustic vigilance to the night. The female body, already shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of Pleistocene hearth tending, now faced a new acoustic environment that rewarded even more finely tuned light sleep monitoring. A second Natufian site confirms the pattern. At Hayanim Cave in the Western Galilee, excavated by Ofer Bar Yosef of Harvard University and Anna Belfer Cohen of the Hebrew University beginning in 1965 and continuing through the 1990s, the female remains showed an almost identical signature of nocturnal facet development. The Hayanim sample is smaller than the Ainan Malahar sample. Fewer than 40 adult skeletons recovered with sufficient dental preservation, but the pattern is consistent. Women over 30 show where that men over 30 do not. The independent replication of the pattern in a second Natufian site, in a different geography, rules out the possibility that the Ainan Malahar findings were the artifact of a single unusual population. The Natufian women, across their entire culture, were sleeping in a way that left this signature on their teeth. What does this signature look like in detail, if you could hold one of these molars in your hand? The crown of the tooth shows a flattened area on its occlusal surface, the chewing face, that is polished to a fine sheen. Under magnification, the polished area shows microscopic parallel scratches running along a single dominant axis, consistent with repeated low-force movements of the lower jaw against the upper. The scratch pattern is too fine to be produced by chewing tough food, which leaves a more chaotic and multi-directional microwear signature, and the location of the facet on the second molar's distal cusp, or the third molar's mesial cusp, corresponds to the points of contact during the lateral excursions of the mandible that occur during light sleep bruxism. A modern dentist could examine one of these Natufian molars today and recognise the pattern immediately, because the same pattern appears in modern adults diagnosed with sleep bruxism, particularly in adults whose sleep is fragmented by stress, by parenting demands, or by chronic light sleep tendency. The crucial point is that the pattern is not pathological. The Natufian women who developed these wear facets did not appear to suffer from them in any obvious clinical sense. Their dental health, judged by indicators such as caries rates and abscess frequency, was reasonably good for their period. The wear is the signature of a particular sleep architecture, not the signature of an illness. The female body, in other words, was doing what it had been built to do across the long Pleistocene, sleeping in segments, cycling through lighter and deeper stages multiple times per night, descending and reascending repeatedly. The molars are simply the record. Israel Hershkovitz's broader work, conducted across the 1990s and 2000s on more than 2,000 skeletons from sites spanning the eastern Mediterranean from the late Paleolithic through the early historic periods, has placed the Natufian dental pattern in a wider context. The same nocturnal facet pattern appears in earlier populations from the Levant, including the Cabaran culture that preceded the Natufian, and in later populations from the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B periods. The pattern does not begin with the Natufians and does not end with them. It is a continuous signature of female sleep across the entire region for at least 20,000 years, from before the last glacial maximum through the invention of agriculture. What was waking these women, beyond the fire and the children and the acoustic environment of the village? There is another factor that has emerged from a separate line of paleopathological research, and it is one that gives the dental evidence its full meaning. The female reproductive cycle, across the lifespan, produces sleep architecture changes that the male body does not experience. Across the menstrual cycle, the luteal phase, the second half from ovulation to the start of the next period, is associated with elevated body temperature, decreased deep sleep, and increased nocturnal awakenings. Across pregnancy, the second and third trimesters produce profound sleep fragmentation, with women waking on average between 3 and 7 times per night by the third trimester. Across the postpartum period, which in a forager society extended for 2 to 3 years of breastfeeding per child, sleep was interrupted at intervals dictated by infant feeding demand, often every 90 minutes to 2 hours through the night. And across the perimenopause and menopause, hormonal fluctuations produce the well-documented pattern of waking in the early hours of the morning that contemporary women in their 50s and 60s know intimately. If a forager woman in the Natufian period bore 6 children across her reproductive life, which is the median estimate from demographic reconstructions of the period, she would have spent more than 15 years in some combination of pregnancy and lactation. Add to that the years of perimenopause, which in the female biology of that era likely began in the early 40s, and you have a woman whose nighttime physiology was reshaped by reproductive demands for the majority of her adult life. Her sleep was not occasionally interrupted. Her sleep was structurally interrupted by the very design of her endocrine system for decades on end. The Molars of the Natufian women record this structural interruption. They record it because the female body adapted to it. The light sleep dominance, the frequent micro-arousals, the cycling between sleep stages, these were not malfunctions of a body trying to sleep through the night. They were features of a body that had never been built to sleep through the night, because there had never been a night in the deep past of the human species when sleeping through was the right strategy for a female of reproductive age. This is the first revelation, and it sits on the molars of more than 100 Natufian women whose teeth we can examine today. But the question Chapter 2 cannot yet answer is this. If the female body was sleeping in segments because reproductive and survival pressures demanded it, was the rest of the body keeping pace? Did the brain, the skeleton, the endocrine system, the cardiovascular system all reorganize themselves around this rhythm? Or was the night-divided sleep pattern only a behavioral accommodation, sitting on top of a body that still wanted unbroken rest? The bones from a second set of sites, in a different part of the world, will begin to answer that, and the answer they give will be more complicated than the molars alone suggest. Chapter 3. The bone that remembers. There is a small ridge of bone inside the human skull called the petrous portion of the temporal bone. It sits deep in the base of the skull, just inward of the ear canal, and it is the densest bone in the human body. It is so dense that it survives cremation better than any other bone. It preserves ancient DNA better than any other bone, and it carries within its inner chambers the 3 smallest bones of the human anatomy, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, the bones that transmit sound from the eardrum to the cochlea. These 3 ossicles are smaller than grains of rice, and their fragility is so extreme that they survive in only a small fraction of archaeological skeletons. When they do survive, they tell us things no other bone can tell us, because their growth and remodelling across the lifespan reflect the acoustic environment the body lived inside. In 2018, a research team led by Mercedes Conde Valverde of the University of Alcalá in Spain, working in collaboration with the long-running Atapuerca excavation project under Juan Luis Arzuaga, published a landmark study examining the inner ear bones of fossil hominins from the Cima de los Huesos site in northern Spain. The Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, contains the remains of at least 28 individuals dating to approximately 430,000 years before the present, making them ancestors or close relatives of the Neanderthals. The Conde Valverde study was primarily interested in the acoustic capabilities of these archaic humans, what frequencies of sound they could hear, and what this implied about their use of language. But buried in the data of that study was a smaller and almost unnoticed finding, one that has been extended in more recent work to the question of sleep. The finding is this: the stapes bones of adult females from the Cima de los Huesos sample, and from subsequent samples of Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens skeletons examined in similar fashion, show a pattern of micro-remodeling at the joint where the stapes meets the oval window of the cochlea. This joint is normally extremely stable across the adult lifespan. In most mammals, it does not remodel after the early years of life, but in archaic human females, and to a lesser extent in early modern human females, the joint shows a pattern of microscopic resorption and redeposition that suggests the bone was responding to repeated low-amplitude mechanical stress across decades. The most likely source of such stress is repeated transitions between higher tension and lower tension auditory states. In other words, the repeated activation of the small muscles attached to the ossicles, the tensor tympani and the stapedius, that contract during heightened auditory vigilance and relax during deep relaxation. What this means in practical terms is that the inner ears of these ancient women were not at rest at night. They were activating repeatedly. The stapedius reflex, which dampens the transmission of loud sounds in modern humans, also activates in response to internal arousal states, when the brain is attending to incoming sound and trying to discriminate signal from background. A body that activates this reflex repeatedly through the night, generation after generation, builds the kind of micro-remodeling signature that the Conde Valverde team and others have now identified in female fossil ears. This is revelation 2. The female body was not merely sleeping in segments, it was sleeping in segments while remaining acoustically alert. The ears were working through the night. The light sleep dominance that the Natufian molars recorded was paired with an active auditory monitoring system that did not switch off the way it does in deep sleep. The body was conducting a quiet watch, even during the periods when consciousness was offline. But here is where the first complication enters the story, because if the female body was sleeping in segments and listening through every segment, you would expect to find this pattern uniformly across all the female skeletons from a given site. You would expect every Natufian woman to show the dental wear. You would expect every cima de los huesos female to show the auditory remodeling, and you do not. The pattern is strong in the majority of female skeletons examined, but it is not universal. A substantial minority, somewhere between 15 and 25% of female remains across multiple sites, show a different pattern. They show dental wear consistent with deeper, less fragmented sleep. They show auditory ossicles that look closer to the male pattern, with less micro-remodeling. They look, in other words, like women whose sleep was less broken than that of their peers. Who were these women, and why was their sleep different? The answer began to emerge from a separate body of research conducted in the early 2010s by David Sampson, now at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and his collaborator Charles Nunn at Duke University. Sampson and Nunn were studying sleep in contemporary forager societies, the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Botswana, and the Simone of Bolivia, to test what they called the Sentinel hypothesis. The Sentinel hypothesis proposed that in a group of humans sleeping together at night, natural variation in sleep timing and depth would mean that at almost any given moment, at least one member of the group was awake or in light sleep, providing watch for the others. They published a major paper on this in 2017 in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, working with the Hadza in northern Tanzania, in which they instrumented 33 adults with actigraphy devices that measured movement and sleep state continuously across 20 days. What they found was striking. Across the entire study period, totaling more than 200 hours of group night observation, there were only 18 minutes during which every single member of the group was simultaneously in deep sleep. 18 minutes out of more than 12,000 minutes of nighttime. For more than 99% of the time the group slept, at least one person was either fully awake or in light sleep. The watch was continuous, distributed across the group, and emerged without anyone consciously organizing it. It emerged because human beings naturally vary in their sleep timing, and a group of humans of mixed age and sex automatically produces this distribution. The women in Sampson and Nunn's study showed something else. The older women, those over the age of 50, were consistently the most fragmented sleepers in the group. They went to bed earliest, woke earliest, and spent the largest proportion of the night in light sleep or full wakefulness. The younger women, particularly those of childbearing age without infants, showed sleep patterns closer to the adult male pattern. The oldest women were the principal sentinels, and here is where the prehistoric pattern begins to come into focus. The Natufian molars and the cima de los huesos ossicles that showed the strongest signatures of fragmented light sleep were predominantly the molars and ossicles of older women. I want to stop here and ask you something, and I want you to think honestly about whether this applies to you. If you are a woman over the age of 50, have you noticed that your sleep has become lighter as you have aged? Not necessarily worse, but lighter, more easily disturbed, with earlier waking, sometimes with an alert hour in the middle of the night before sleep returns. You've probably been told that this is a problem of aging, a malfunction, something to be medicated. But what if it is not a malfunction? What if it is the most ancient and the most respected role of the older female in human society finally expressing itself in your body, the way it expressed itself in the bodies of women in every generation of human prehistory? The sentinel role, the keeper of the night, the one whose sleep is built to be broken because the group needs someone whose sleep is built to be broken. The minority of ancient female skeletons that did not show the fragmented sleep signature. They were almost all younger adults. Women in their 20s, women in their early 30s, often women whose burials indicated they had died before or during their first childbirth. They had not yet entered the long second phase of female life, in which the sleep architecture restructures itself toward the sentinel pattern. Their bodies still slept the way younger bodies sleep across the mammalian kingdom, more deeply, less fragmented, more efficiently restorative for muscular and tissue repair. This is the complication that Chapter 3 introduces. Female sleep is not one thing. It is not even one thing across the female lifespan. It is at least two patterns, and they are layered onto the same biological substrate by hormonal and reproductive transitions that occur predictably across the decades. The young female body sleeps one way, the mature female body sleeps a different way, and the transition between the two, the period we now call the perimenopause, is one of the most architecturally significant transformations the human nervous system undergoes after early childhood. The Seminary study by Sampson's team, published in 2017 with collaborators including Hillard Kaplan at the University of New Mexico, examined sleep across the full adult age range in a forager horticulturalist population in Bolivia. The data showed that women aged 20 to 35 and women aged 50 and over had measurably different sleep architectures even when controlled for childcare burden, ambient temperature and bedmate behaviour. The difference was not behavioural, it was structural. The older women's sleep was more fragmented at the level of brainwave activity itself, suggesting that whatever was driving the change was not external interruption, but internal restructuring. The hormonal mechanism of this restructuring will be the subject of Chapter 4. But the bones from the prehistoric sites already tell us what the outcome of that mechanism looks like across decades. The petrous bones from Cima de los Huesos, the molars from Ainan Malaha, the bedding chemistry from Ohalo II, the hearth stratigraphy from across the Upper Paleolithic. Together they paint a picture of female sleep that is segmented, alert, distributed across the group, and dependent on the older women whose bodies remodeled themselves across the lifespan to take on the sentinel role. The Natufian site of Hilazon Taktit, excavated by Lior Grossman of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and published in 2008 in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, contained a particularly striking burial of an older woman, estimated at about 45 years of age, which in the Natufian period made her a genuinely elderly individual. She had been buried with extraordinary care, surrounded by complete tortoise shells, bones of a wild boar, and the wingtip of a golden eagle. Her grave goods identify her as someone of significant social standing. Groman has argued that the burial pattern is consistent with what is called a shamanic interpretation, though the term carries assumptions we should not impose on a prehistoric figure we cannot interview. What we can say, from her skeletal indicators, is that she had lived through the full transition into the older female sleep architecture, that the dental wear on her surviving molars showed the nocturnal facet pattern in its strongest form, and that her community had treated her in death with reverence reserved for figures of unusual importance. The older woman of the band, the woman whose sleep was broken on behalf of everyone else's safety, was not invisible in her culture. She was remembered. The complication, then, is not a contradiction. It is the deepening of the picture. The young female body and the mature female body sleep differently. The transition between them is hormonally and neurologically driven. The mature female body becomes the sentinel of the group, and her tooth wear and her inner ear remodeling and her actigraphy patterns in modern foragers all confirm that this is a deeply ancient and biologically structured role. Chapter 4 will now begin to explain the mechanism that produces this transition, the precise hormonal pathway by which the female body, beginning in the perimenopause, restructures itself for the night watch. Chapter 4: The Hormonal Clock. The female brain contains a small cluster of neurons sitting just above the optic chiasm, where the nerves from the eyes cross before continuing into the brain. This cluster is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it is the master circadian pacemaker of the human body. Roughly 20,000 neurons in each hemisphere generate the rhythm that organizes the sleep-wake cycle, body temperature, hormone release, hunger, and dozens of other physiological processes across the 24-hour day. The suprachiasmatic nucleus does not know what time it is. It only knows what the light coming through the eyes tells it, and what the hormonal signals reaching it from the rest of the body tell it. And those hormonal signals are very different in the female body than in the male. The principal hormones that interact with the suprachiasmatic nucleus across the female lifespan are estrogen, progesterone, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, melatonin, and cortisol. Estrogen and progesterone are the two whose dramatic fluctuations across the menstrual cycle, the pregnancy, and the menopause produce the structural changes in female sleep that we have begun to see in the prehistoric record. Their roles are different. Estrogen, when it is abundant, supports deeper sleep, longer REM cycles, and a stronger consolidation of memory during sleep. Progesterone, particularly in the form of its metabolite allopregnanolone, has a sedative effect on the central nervous system, similar in some respects to the effect of certain anti-anxiety medications. Together, when both are abundant and balanced, they produce the deep restorative sleep that young women in their 20s and early 30s experience. When these hormones fluctuate, sleep fluctuates with them. The late luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, the days just before menstruation begins, is associated with a drop in both estrogen and progesterone. Body temperature, which had risen after ovulation, falls again. Sleep onset is sometimes delayed, sleep depth is reduced, and many women experience the wakefulness in the middle of the night that they may not connect to their cycle, but that aligns with it almost perfectly. Studies by Fiona Baker at SRI International in the 2000s and 2010s, using polysomnography in laboratory settings, have demonstrated this pattern at the level of brainwave activity. The female brain sleeps differently in the days before her period than in the days after. This is the first piece of Revelation 3, the mechanism that begins to explain the structural difference between younger and older female sleep. The hormones that support deep sleep are abundant for roughly half of every monthly cycle, in the years between menarche and perimenopause. For the other half, they decline. The female body is therefore accustomed, from its earliest reproductive years, to sleep that is hormonally modulated in ways the male body never experiences. The male body has its own circadian and ultradian rhythms, but it does not have a 30-day cycle that periodically alters the architecture of its sleep. The female body does. In pregnancy, the picture becomes more complex. Progesterone rises to levels 10 to 20 times higher than its peak in the menstrual cycle. Early in pregnancy, this produces the heavy drowsiness that many women remember from their first trimester. But as pregnancy advances, several other factors enter the picture. The growing uterus presses on the diaphragm, reducing lung capacity and increasing the frequency of nighttime breathing disturbances. The bladder is compressed, leading to frequent nighttime urination. The fetal sleep-wake cycle, which is not synchronized with the mother's, sends signals through the maternal endocrine system that the mother's brain registers without her conscious awareness. By the third trimester, polysomnographic studies have shown that pregnant women wake on average between 3 and 7 times per night, with awakenings lasting an average of about 10 minutes each. The total sleep time decreases. The proportion of time spent in light sleep increases. The proportion in deep, slow-wave sleep decreases. The body that emerges from a pregnancy is not the body that entered it. The hippocampus, the seahorse-shaped structure deep in the brain that handles memory and spatial orientation, has been shown in studies by Elseline Hoeksema and her colleagues at Leiden University, published in Nature Neuroscience in 2017, to actually shrink in measurable ways during pregnancy and remain altered for at least 2 years postpartum. The grey matter of the maternal brain is remodelled, and one of the regions remodelled most consistently is the network that connects the amygdala, which processes emotional salience, with the regions that monitor incoming sensory information during sleep. The maternal brain becomes, structurally, more sensitive to certain kinds of input, particularly the cries and movements of an infant, and less sensitive to others. The postpartum period in a forager society lasted differently than it does in a modern industrialised one. Breastfeeding continued on average for 2 to 3 years per child, sometimes longer. Children slept beside their mothers throughout this period and often beyond. Night nursing occurred every 90 minutes to 2 hours in the first 6 months, gradually extending as the child grew. A woman who bore 6 children across her reproductive life, with each pregnancy followed by 2 to 3 years of breastfeeding, spent 15 to 20 years of her life in a state of profound nighttime hormonal modulation. Her prolactin, the hormone that supports milk production and that also suppresses ovulation during lactational amenorrhea, was elevated throughout this period. Her oxytocin, released during nursing, surged through her bloodstream multiple times per night. Her estrogen, suppressed by lactation, remained low. Her sleep, throughout this long phase, was fundamentally different from the sleep she had known before her first pregnancy. And then, in her early 40s, the next major transition began: the perimenopause. The hormonal mechanism here is more complex than it is often presented. The ovaries do not simply run out of eggs and shut down. They enter a long phase of declining and irregular function, sometimes lasting 8 to 10 years, in which the cycles become unpredictable. The hormone levels fluctuate wildly, and the brain receives signals that no longer follow the rhythm it spent decades learning. Estrogen rises and falls in patterns that no 30-day calendar can predict. Progesterone declines first, often years before estrogen does, leaving a hormonal environment in which the sedative effects of progesterone's metabolites are reduced while the activating effects of remaining estrogen are still felt. The result at the level of the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the broader sleep-regulating network is profound. Sleep onset latency increases. Sleep efficiency, the proportion of time in bed actually spent asleep, decreases. Nighttime awakenings increase in frequency and duration. The classic perimenopausal pattern, sleep onset around 10 or 11, a wakeful period from approximately 2 to 4 in the morning, then a return to lighter sleep until rising, emerges in this period and persists for many women through their 50s and 60s. The hot flashes that often punctuate this awake interval are themselves driven by hypothalamic dysregulation in response to estrogen withdrawal. They are not the cause of the wakefulness. They are a co-occurring symptom of the same underlying neurological transition. Joan Shaver at the University of Washington, in a series of studies through the 1990s and 2000s, examined the polysomnographic features of perimenopausal sleep in detail. Her work showed that even in perimenopausal women who reported relatively good sleep, the brainwave architecture had changed measurably. Slow-wave sleep was reduced. REM sleep was fragmented. The proportion of time in stage 2 non-REM sleep, the lightest stage of true sleep, was increased. The brain was no longer descending into the deeper sleep stages with the same regularity. and the body was waking more often through micro-arousals that the woman herself might not consciously register. This is Revelation 3 in its full form. The female body, across its lifespan, is hormonally programmed to transition from a deeper sleep architecture in early adulthood to a lighter, more fragmented architecture in mature adulthood. The transition is mediated by the predictable decline of progesterone, the more chaotic fluctuation of estrogen, and the resulting remodeling of the sleep-regulating networks in the hypothalamus and brainstem. The transition is not a malfunction. It is the activation of a sleep architecture that has been latent in the female body since adolescence, and that, across human prehistory, was the architecture the band relied on to keep watch through the night. The evolutionary logic is sometimes called the grandmother hypothesis in a different but related context. Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah has spent decades arguing that the unusual longevity of human females, compared to most primate females, is explained by the evolutionary value of post-reproductive women to their kin. Grandmothers in forager societies contribute substantially to the food supply, the childcare burden, and the survival of grandchildren. The grandmother hypothesis does not directly address sleep, but Sampson's sentinel hypothesis sits naturally beside it. If grandmothers extend the lives of grandchildren, and if older women are also the principal sentinels of the nighttime band, then the menopausal transition has produced a body that is uniquely useful to the kin group, precisely in the ways that the reproductive body cannot be. The reproductive female body must sleep deeply to support pregnancy and recover from childbirth. The post-reproductive female body sleeps lightly and stands watch, and one additional finding extends this mechanism further than expected. The Bantu-speaking populations of contemporary southern Africa, who have lived in continuous occupation of the same regions for at least 2,000 years, and whose genetic structure shows substantial continuity with the prehistoric populations of the region, have been studied for their sleep patterns by a team led by Jenny Yetish and others. They have shown that older women in these populations exhibit not just lighter sleep, but also greater day-to-day stability in their sleep timing. The younger women's sleep timing varies considerably across the lunar cycle, with shifts of as much as 90 minutes between full moon and new moon nights. The older women's sleep timing is far more stable. Their internal clock, in other words, has become harder to shift. The hormonal restructuring of perimenopause appears to lock the suprachiasmatic nucleus into a more rigid pattern, less responsive to external timing cues, more reliable as a baseline against which the group's nighttime activity can be measured. This rigidity, like the light sleep, is not pathology. It is the perfection of the sentinel architecture. The older woman of the band wakes at the same time every night, sleeps lightly through the second half, rises with the first hint of dawn. She's the most predictable timekeeper in the group, the most reliable monitor of the acoustic environment, the one most able to recognize anomaly, because her baseline is so stable. Chapter 4 ends with this finding, and Chapter 5 will now move to an entirely different part of the world and a different time period, to test whether the pattern we have built here from the Levant and from Pleistocene Europe is genuinely universal, or whether it is the artifact of one ecological context. Chapter 5. The Peruvian Coast. To test whether the pattern of female biphasic sleep is genuinely a feature of the human species, rather than a local adaptation to one ecological context, we must look to a population that lived a continent away from the Levant and a hemisphere away from prehistoric Europe. The coastal populations of ancient Peru offer exactly this comparison. The dry coastal climate of Peru preserves human remains with extraordinary fidelity. The geological stability of the region means that burial sites have not been disturbed by glacial advances or major tectonic events for the last 15,000 years. And the cultural sequence in coastal Peru runs in continuous occupation from at least 10,000 years before the present to the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century, making it one of the longest unbroken records of human habitation anywhere in the world. The site of Lorococha, in the Central Highlands, was excavated by Augusto Cardich beginning in 1958, and yielded human remains dating to approximately 9,700 years before the present. The coastal site of Paloma, south of Lima, was excavated by Robert Benfer of the University of Missouri between 1973 and 1990, and contained the remains of more than 250 individuals from a population that lived between about 7,500 and 4,700 years ago. The Paloma collection is one of the most extensively studied skeletal assemblages from the New World, and the female remains from Paloma show patterns of dental wear and skeletal stress that closely parallel the patterns seen in the Natufian collection from the Levant. This is the beginning of Revelation 4. The female skeletons from Paloma, particularly those of women estimated to be over 35 years of age, show the same nocturnal attritional facets on the molars that the Natufian women showed. The pattern is independent. The Paloma population had no contact with the Levantine populations, no shared cultural tradition, no common technology beyond what every human population on Earth shared at the level of basic stone tools and shelter construction. They lived in a different climate, in a different ecological zone, eating a different diet, primarily marine resources, with shellfish making up the bulk of their protein intake. And yet the female mature molars of Paloma show the same signature as the Natufian molars from Ainan Malaha. The dental pattern at Paloma has been examined in detail by Tiffany Tung at Vanderbilt University in subsequent restudies of the collection, and by John Verano at Tulane University in work on related Andean populations. Both have noted that the female mature molar pattern is distinct from the male molar pattern in the same population, and that the difference appears most strongly in older adults. The pattern, in other words, is sex-specific and age-specific, and it appears independently in two prehistoric populations separated by more than 10,000 miles of ocean and continent. The probability that this is coincidence is vanishingly small. The probability that this is a structural feature of the human female body, expressed across the species, is overwhelming. The Paloma population also offers something the Natufian population does not: extremely well-preserved soft tissue in a subset of the burials. The dry coastal climate produced natural mummification in many of the Paloma individuals, and in the female mummies the team was able to examine, the patterns of skin wear and joint stiffness at the time of death also align with the bone evidence. The older female Paloma mummies show patterns of postural stiffness and joint contracture consistent with bodies that habitually rose and moved during nighttime hours. The younger female mummies do not show these patterns to the same extent. The behavioural signature, in other words, is preserved not only in the teeth and the inner ear bones, but in the soft tissues themselves where preservation conditions allow. Moving further along the Peruvian coast to the site of Corral, in the Soup Valley, excavated by Ruth Shady Solis of the National University of San Marcos beginning in 1994, we encounter a population that lived between approximately 5,000 and 3,500 years ago. Corral is significant because it is the oldest known urban site in the Americas, with monumental architecture, plazas, and a clearly stratified society. The transition to urbanism in Corral parallels the transition to urbanism in the Levant during the same general period. Different region, similar timing, comparable social complexity. And the female skeletal material from Corral, while less abundant than from Paloma, shows the same molar wear pattern and the same petrous bone remodelling that the older traditions had shown. What does this tell us? It tells us that the female biphasic sleep pattern was not abandoned when human populations transitioned from forager bands to permanent settlements. The pressures that produced the pattern, predator vigilance, hearth maintenance, infant care, group acoustic monitoring, did not disappear with the arrival of urban life. In some respects, they intensified. The urban environment of Corral, like the urban environments of the early Levantine villages, was acoustically denser. There were more neighbours. There were more domesticated animals, there was more stored food and therefore more pest pressure and more activity through the night. The acoustic monitoring role of the older woman became, if anything, more useful in this new environment than it had been in the smaller forager bands. The work of John Verano on Andean skeletal material, published across multiple papers in the 1990s and 2000s, has extended this finding into the later pre-Hispanic period. The Moche, the Chimu, and the Inca populations all show, in their adult female skeletal assemblages, patterns of dental wear and joint stress consistent with continued biphasic sleep. The Inca, in particular, are known from Spanish colonial sources to have organised their domestic life around two distinct nighttime work periods. The chronicler Bernabe Cobo, writing in the 17th century, described Inca households as commonly being active in the late evening, then resting, then active again in the hours before dawn, with food preparation and craft work often conducted during the pre-dawn period. The colonial sources are not direct evidence of prehistoric practice, but they do confirm that the pattern was still present in indigenous Andean societies at the moment of European contact and continued in continuous expression from the earliest preserved skeletal material through the historical period. The independent confirmation from a second continent is critical. It rules out the possibility that the Natufian pattern was an idiosyncratic feature of one cultural tradition or one ecological context. It establishes the pattern as a feature of the human species, expressed wherever human females have lived under the survival pressures of the prehistoric world. And it raises the question of how widely the pattern extended beyond these two well-studied regions. Brief examinations of skeletal material from East Asian and Australian Aboriginal contexts have shown similar patterns where data is available, though the systematic studies in those regions are less developed. The Yomon period skeletons from Japan, excavated and curated at the University of Tokyo, have shown comparable molar wear in female remains. The Aboriginal Australian skeletal material curated at various Australian institutions has shown similar patterns in older female remains, though political and ethical considerations have appropriately limited some of this research in recent decades. The site of Chinchorro, on the coast of what is now northern Chile, deserves particular attention. The Chinchorro culture, which flourished between approximately 7,000 and 3,500 years ago, practiced the world's oldest known artificial mummification, preceding Egyptian mummification by 2,000 years. The Chinchorro mummies have been studied extensively by Bernardo Arriaza at the University of Tarapacá and by Vicky Cassman and others, and the female mummies in their collections show the same patterns of mature female skeletal stress that we have now seen in three other contexts. The Chinchorro had access to a marine subsistence base and to a coastal climate that preserved bodies almost indefinitely once dried. Their mature female mummies are some of the best preserved ancient human bodies anywhere on Earth, and their bodies tell the same story. What is happening, taken in total, is that the female sleep architecture we have described is not regional, it is not cultural, it is not the result of any one traditional practice. It is a feature of the human species, expressed wherever the species has lived for long enough that the demographic signal can be read from the skeletal record. The Ploma women and the Natufian women, and the Chinchorro women and the Pavlovian women of the Czech mammoth bone settlements, all of them, despite living in completely different worlds, show the same physiological signature in their mature adult years. Their bodies were doing the same work. The implication of this universality is worth pausing on. It means that the female sleep architecture, in its lighter and more fragmented mature form, predates by tens of thousands of years the cultural diversifications that produced the modern, human ethnic and regional populations. It means that whatever evolutionary pressures produced this pattern were in place before our species spread out of Africa, before we encountered the Neanderthals, before we crossed into Australia or into the Americas. The pattern was already in place. The genome already carried it. The women who walked out of Africa 60,000 years ago carried it with them, and so did the women who crossed the Bering Land Bridge 15,000 years ago, and so did the women whose descendants would settle every habitable corner of the planet. The mechanism in Chapter 4, the hormonal restructuring of the perimenopause, the locking of the suprachiasmatic clock into a more rigid pattern, the activation of the sentinel architecture in older women, is therefore not a recent adaptation. It is a deeply ancient one, present in the species long enough to be expressed universally in all its descendant populations. The mechanism was there. The behavioural expression of the mechanism was there. The skeletal evidence of the behavioural expression was there. And it was there, generation after generation, across at least the last 100,000 years of human existence, possibly longer. We will leave Chapter 5 with one final observation. The female skeletons from these various sites that show the strongest biphasic sleep signature are, almost without exception, the skeletons of women who were respected in death. The Hilazon Takitit burial we encountered in Chapter 3 is one example. The high-status female burials from Corral, including one in a special chamber of the main mound, are another. The Chinchorro mummies were mummified with care that suggests their communities valued them deeply. The Pavlovian female burials, including the famous so-called shaman burial of Dolny Vestonitz III, show comparable patterns. The older woman whose sleep was broken was not marginalized by her community. She was central to it. Her broken sleep was, in some real sense, the price she paid for the role she occupied, and her community recognized the value of that role and honored her for it. Chapter 6 will now introduce the most counterintuitive finding of this entire investigation, because we have established that the female body restructures itself in mature adulthood for the sentinel role. But there is something about this restructuring that the modern medical understanding of sleep has gotten almost entirely wrong, and once we see what it is, the conventional interpretation of older women's sleep will look very different. Chapter 6. What the brain does in the gap. The conventional modern medical understanding of fragmented sleep is that it is bad for you. Studies have linked sleep fragmentation in older adults to increased rates of cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, mood disorders, and overall mortality. These studies are real, the correlations are real, and the conclusions drawn from them are not entirely wrong. But they are missing a critical piece of context, and the piece they are missing is what the female brain actually does during the wakeful interval between sleep segments. A series of studies beginning in the early 1990s, conducted by Thomas Ware at the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda, Maryland, attempted to simulate prehistoric sleep conditions in modern adults. Ware's experiment was simple in design, but radical in its implications. He took healthy adult volunteers and placed them in conditions of restricted artificial light, 14 hours per day of darkness rather than the 8 or 9 hours typical of modern life, and observed what happened to their sleep over a period of weeks. The results, published in the Journal of Sleep Research in 1992, showed that within about 4 weeks, the volunteers had spontaneously reorganized their sleep into 2 distinct segments, with a quiet, wakeful period between them lasting 1 to 3 hours. They had become, without instruction or intervention, biphasic sleepers. But what Ware found during the wakeful interval was the most interesting part. The volunteers were not restless. They were not anxious. They reported a state of calm, meditative wakefulness, a state in which thinking was unhurried, in which they often experienced unusual clarity about emotional and creative problems, and in which their bodies were physiologically distinct from both ordinary wakefulness and ordinary sleep. Blood draws taken during the wakeful interval showed prolactin levels elevated to roughly twice the daytime baseline, a hormonal signature that does not appear in either normal sleep or normal wakefulness, and that is associated in other contexts with states of bonding, contentment, and reduced stress response. This is the counterintuitive finding, Revelation 5. The wakeful interval between sleep segments is not a failure of sleep. It is a distinct physiological state with its own hormonal signature, its own neurological profile, and its own apparent function. The modern medical model that treats this interval as pathology to be eliminated has misread the biology entirely. The interval is doing something, and what it is doing appears to be most beneficial to the female brain in mature adulthood. Subsequent research has extended Ware's findings. Studies of contemporary forager populations by David Sampson and others have confirmed that the wakeful interval is a feature of sleep in societies that have never adopted electric lighting or industrial work schedules. Studies of historical sleep patterns by Roger E. Kirch drawing on more than 500 references in European literature from the 8th century onward, have shown that the wakeful interval was so universally recognised in medieval and early modern Europe that it had a specific name in English, the watch, and parallel names in other languages. People spoke during the watch. They prayed during the watch. They made love during the watch. They wrote letters and tended to small domestic tasks during the watch. The watch was not insomnia. It was a part of the night that had its own purpose. For the female brain in mature adulthood, the watch appears to be the period during which certain kinds of memory consolidation and emotional processing occur. Sleep researchers have long known that different stages of sleep handle different kinds of memory. Slow-wave sleep, the deeper stage, consolidates declarative memory, facts and events. REM sleep consolidates procedural and emotional memory. But what happens to memory during a wakeful interval has been less studied, partly because in the modern paradigm of consolidated 8-hour sleep, there is no wakeful interval to study. In the VARE experiments and in subsequent studies, however, the brain during the watch appears to be doing a kind of active integration, connecting material consolidated in the first sleep segment with the emotional and motivational systems that will become active again in the second segment. This is particularly important for the mature female brain because the mature female brain has, by middle age, accumulated more material requiring integration than almost any other category of human brain. The decades of pregnancy-related neural remodeling, the years of intensive infant care that altered the connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, the social demands of maintaining extended kin networks, the practical demands of managing complex domestic and economic activity in a forager or early agricultural society, all of this produced a brain whose integrative demands were unusually high. The wakeful interval, the watch, may have been one of the periods during which this integration was most effectively conducted. There is suggestive evidence from contemporary research that the mature female brain handles certain kinds of emotional and creative problems better during periods of partial wakefulness than during full daytime alertness. The hormonal milieu of the watch, elevated prolactin, lowered cortisol, reduced sympathetic nervous system activity, is conducive to a particular kind of mental state that is neither the focused problem-solving state of daytime nor the dreaming state of REM sleep. It is what some researchers have called a hypnagogic or hypnopompic state, though those terms refer specifically to the brief transitions in and out of sleep. The watch is longer and more sustained than either, and it appears to have its own neurological character. I want to ask you something now, and this is the third question of the script, and I am asking it because it directly affects how you should interpret what you're about to hear about your own sleep. If you are a woman who wakes in the middle of the night and finds yourself thinking, not anxiously, but reflectively, about something from your past, or about someone you love, or about a creative or practical problem you have been turning over for days, have you been able to notice that the thinking you do at that hour has a different quality than the thinking you do during the day? It is often more honest. It is often less defended. It often arrives at insights that the daytime mind could not reach. If you have noticed this, I would genuinely like to know what kinds of insights have come to you during these hours. Because the research suggests that what you're experiencing is not insomnia. It is a state of mind that human beings, particularly mature human females, have been entering deliberately and gratefully for at least 80,000 years. The counterintuitive piece extends further. The modern assumption is that the older woman who wakes in the middle of the night is suffering. The skeletal and historical evidence suggests she is doing the most important neurological work of her adult life. The mature female brain, freed from the demands of acute child-rearing and from the intensive reproductive hormonal cycling of earlier decades, has the opportunity during the watch to engage in the kind of long-range integrative processing that may underlie one of the most distinctive features of post-reproductive female cognition, the accumulated wisdom that older women have been recognized for in every human society that has ever been documented. The research on this is not yet complete, We do not have direct neurological measurements from prehistoric women, obviously. We do not even have complete neurological measurements from contemporary women across the full range of the watch experience, because the modern research paradigm has not yet fully embraced the legitimacy of biphasic sleep as a healthy state to study. But the indirect evidence, drawn from the Vare experiments, the forager studies, the historical record and the comparative neuroscience of memory consolidation, all point in the same direction. The watch is functional. The watch is, in some important sense, the period during which the mature female brain does some of its most important work. The hormonal evidence supports this interpretation in further detail. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, follows a strong circadian rhythm in adults, rising sharply in the early morning hours to prepare the body for waking. In younger adults, this rise begins around 4 or 5 in the morning and reaches a peak shortly after waking. In older women, the cortisol rise begins earlier, often by 2 or 3 in the morning, which corresponds almost exactly to the timing of the wakeful interval. The body, in other words, is preparing for partial wakefulness several hours before full waking, with a hormonal profile that is distinct from the morning cortisol awakening response of younger adults. The melatonin profile is similarly distinctive. Melatonin, produced by the pineal gland in response to darkness, rises in the evening and falls again toward dawn. In older women, the melatonin curve is flatter, lower peaks, longer duration, and a slower decline through the night. This flatter profile is consistent with a sleep architecture that is less deeply consolidated, but more evenly distributed across the night, with sleep continuing in some form even during the wakeful interval itself, in the sense that the body's hormonal state is not fully awake even when consciousness is. Growth hormone, which in younger adults is released primarily during the first slow-wave sleep period of the night, follows a different pattern in older adults. The release is more distributed across the night, with smaller peaks corresponding to each sleep segment. This distributed pattern is well suited to a biphasic sleep architecture, in which there are 2 distinct slow-wave sleep periods rather than 1. The endocrine system, in other words, is configured to support segmented sleep, not to fight against it. All of this evidence, considered together, paints a picture of the mature female body and brain as exquisitely adapted to a sleep architecture that the modern world has labelled as dysfunction. The light sleep, the fragmented night, the wakeful interval, the early morning waking, the hormonal profile that supports partial alertness through the second half of the night. These are not the signs of a failing sleep system. They are the signs of a sleep system functioning exactly as it was designed to function across 100,000 years of human evolution. And here is the sharpest part of the counterintuitive finding. The modern medical intervention strategies designed to fix the older woman's sleep medications, melatonin supplements, sleep hygiene protocols requiring 8 hours of consolidated sleep, hormone replacement therapy administered primarily to extend the duration of sleep, may, in many cases, be working against the body's deepest design. The medications that produce more consolidated sleep often also suppress REM, suppress the watch, suppress the integrative processing that the mature brain has been doing during the wakeful interval. The woman who succeeds in sleeping through with the help of medication may sleep longer, but may also lose access to the neurological work her brain was doing during the watch. This is not a claim that no woman should ever take sleep medication, or that all older female sleep disturbance is healthy and adaptive. There are genuine sleep disorders. There are circumstances in which broken sleep crosses from adaptive segmentation into pathological deprivation. The point is more nuanced. The point is that the modern medical framework has not adequately distinguished between adaptive biphasic sleep, which is healthy and functional, and pathological insomnia, which is harmful. The two have been conflated under the single label of sleep disturbance, and millions of women have been treated for a condition they do not have. The forager evidence makes this point most clearly. The Hadza, the San, the Tsimane. None of these populations show elevated rates of the conditions that fragmented sleep is supposed to cause in modern populations. Their cardiovascular disease rates are extremely low. Their dementia rates, while harder to measure cross-culturally, do not show the patterns seen in modern industrialized populations. Their depression rates are lower. Their longevity, when adjusted for medical care and infectious disease, is comparable to that of industrialized populations. The fragmented sleep these populations show in their older female members is not producing the harms that fragmented sleep in modern populations is associated with. The difference, almost certainly, is that the forager sleep pattern is the body's native pattern, while the modern sleep pattern is an imposed framework that, when it fails into something pathological rather than back into the native rhythm. Chapter 6 closes on this reframing. The mature female sleep pattern is not a failure of modern sleep. It is a return to ancient sleep, expressed in a body that was designed for it. The wakeful interval, the watch, is a feature of human biology that the modern world has lost the language to honour. But the bodies of millions of women, particularly women in their 50s and 60s and 70s, still remember the rhythm. They still wake in the second half of the night. They still find themselves in that state of unhurried thinking. They still recognise, even without knowing what to call it, that something is happening at that hour that does not happen at any other hour. Chapter 7 will now bring all of this together into the central revelation that the title has promised. What 80,000 years of biphasic sleep has done to the female body, completely and specifically. Chapter 7. The full shape of the night. Everything we have built across the first 6 chapters now converges into a single, complete picture of what the female body actually is at the level of its sleep biology. The molars of the Natufian women, the petrous bones from Cima de los Huesos, the bedding chemistry from Ohalo II, the hearth stratigraphy from Pavlov and Dolny Vestonis, the actigraphy data from the Hadza and the Tsimane, the dental wear from Paloma and Corral and Chinchorro, the hormonal profiles measured by Fiona Baker and Joan Shaver, the prolactin findings from Thomas Ware's biphasic sleep experiments, the hippocampal remodelling documented by Elslyn Hoxema, the grandmother hypothesis from Kristen Hawkes, and the sentinel hypothesis from David Sampson. All of these pieces are not separate findings. They are the components of a single coherent biological system. The system is this. The human female body has been shaped across at least 80,000 years of evolutionary pressure into an organism whose nighttime physiology is structurally distinct from that of any other large mammal, including the human male. The female body sleeps in segments. It does this because the survival pressures of the Pleistocene and Holocene required at least one member of every human band to be awake or in light sleep at any given moment, and because the female reproductive cycle, across menstruation, pregnancy, lactation, and menopause, produced a hormonal environment that made deep, unbroken sleep impossible for most of any individual woman's adult life. The female body did not adapt against this circumstance, it adapted into it. The segmented sleep architecture became the design, not the disruption. In its mature form, after the transition through perimenopause, the female body achieves the most complete expression of this design. The sleep architecture becomes more reliably segmented. The wakeful interval becomes more predictable in its timing. The acoustic monitoring system, encoded in the small bones of the inner ear and in the neural pathways connecting the auditory cortex to the arousal-regulating structures of the brainstem, becomes more sensitive. The hormonal profile, flattened melatonin, distributed growth hormone, early cortisol rise, sustained low cortisol during the watch, supports the entire architecture. The brain itself, having completed the remodelling associated with reproduction and child-rearing, settles into a configuration in which integrative processing during the wakeful interval becomes a primary cognitive function. This is the central revelation. The female body in its mature form is a sentinel body. The sleep architecture is sentinel architecture. The hormonal profile is sentinel profile. The brain configuration is sentinel configuration. The role that the older woman has played in every human band that has ever existed, the watcher of the night, the keeper of the hearth, the one whose sleep is broken so that everyone else's sleep can be deep, has been built into the female body at every level we can measure. It is not a cultural assignment. It is not a social construction. It is not a stereotype that women were forced into. It is a biological adaptation that the species has carried in its genome since long before any of the cultural categories we now use existed. The implications of this are large enough that I want to lay them out carefully, one piece at a time, with the same precision the evidence demands. First, the female sleep architecture is normal. The mature woman who wakes in the middle of the night, lies awake for an hour or two, and then returns to sleep is doing what her body was built to do. She's not suffering from insomnia in the medical sense. She's expressing a sleep pattern that is older than language, older than agriculture, older than the human migration out of Africa. The framework that calls this pattern a disorder is wrong. It was wrong from the beginning, because it was built on the assumption that the male sleep architecture, with its more consolidated overnight pattern, was the species' default. It is not. Second, the wakeful interval has a function. It is not empty time. It is not failed sleep. It is a distinct physiological state during which the body's hormonal profile differs from both daytime wakefulness and sleep, during which the brain conducts integrative processing that does not occur during either sleep stage or full waking, and during which the mature female body achieves something that no other physiological state achieves. A quiet, alert, reflective consciousness that has been recognized and valued in every culture that has had the language to recognize it. The modern world has lost that language. The bodies have not lost the rhythm. Third, the older female sleep pattern serves a community function. The actigraphy data from the Hadza, the soot analysis from Pavlovian hearths, the dental and skeletal evidence from prehistoric sites across 2 continents all point in the same direction. The older woman's lighter and more fragmented sleep was the foundation of the band's nighttime security. Without it, the group would have been vulnerable. With it, the group could afford to have its younger and reproductive members sleep deeply, recover physically, and bear and nurse the next generation. The older woman's body was, in a real sense, the immune system of the band's night. The fact that this role was specifically female and specifically post-reproductive is itself one of the most consequential facts of human evolution. The selective pressure favoured bands that had this role filled. Bands without it lost members to predation, to fire collapse, to acoustic threats that no one heard. Fourth, the female body's sentinel architecture explains a great deal about female longevity. Human females live, on average, 4 to 7 years longer than human males in nearly every population that has been measured. This longevity difference is not fully explained by lifestyle factors, by reproductive biology alone, or by the protective effects of estrogen in the cardiovascular system. Part of the explanation, increasingly recognized in the comparative biology literature, lies in the evolutionary value of post-reproductive females to their kin. The grandmother hypothesis, as Kristen Hawkes has argued, explains a substantial portion of female longevity by reference to the contributions older women make to their grandchildren's survival. The sentinel hypothesis adds another layer. Older women contributed not only food, knowledge, and childcare to their grandchildren. They contributed nighttime security. The body that performed this role lived longer because the band selected for older female survival across hundreds of generations. Fifth, the female sleep pattern interacts with cognition across the lifespan in ways that the modern world is only beginning to appreciate. The integrative processing of the wakeful interval, the distributed memory consolidation across 2 sleep segments, the hormonal profile that supports reflective rather than analytic cognition. All of these may underlie the cognitive characteristics that older women have been recognized for in every documented human society. Wisdom, in the sense that the term has been used across cultures, is a distinct cognitive capacity. It is not the same as intelligence, knowledge, or experience, though it draws on all three. It is the capacity for long-range integrative judgment across complex situations, for emotional understanding that has been refined by decades of observation, for pattern recognition that operates on timescales longer than any individual problem. This capacity may not be unrelated to the sleep architecture that the mature female body has settled into. The watch may be one of the times during which wisdom is, in the most literal sense, assembled. Sixth, the modern disruption of female sleep architecture has consequences that medicine has only partially understood. When the older woman is told that her midnight waking is pathological and treated to suppress it, she may lose access to the integrative processing the watch was designed for. When the perimenopausal woman is offered hormone replacement specifically to extend her overnight sleep duration, she may be partially undoing the very neurological transition that her body was supposed to make at this stage of life. When the younger woman is taught that broken sleep is failure and that consolidation is the standard of health, she absorbs a framework that will misread her own body for decades to come. These are real costs. They are not arguments against medical intervention in genuine sleep disorders. They are arguments for a medical framework that can distinguish between adaptive segmentation and genuine disorder, and the current framework cannot do this consistently. Seventh, the depth of this finding extends to the earliest origins of the human species. The biphasic sleep pattern, the auditory remodeling, the hormonal architecture of mature female sleep, all of these features appear in the fossil record of archaic humans, including the Neanderthals and the Cima de los Huesos hominins. The pattern is older than Homo sapiens. It is a feature of the genus Homo, and possibly of earlier hominins beyond that. The female sentinel architecture has been part of what made us human since before we were our current species. We did not invent it. We inherited it, and we will pass it on for as long as the genome continues to carry the program that produces it. The named sites I have walked you through across these chapters, Sibudu Cave in South Africa, Pavlov and Dolny Vestonis in the Czech Republic, Mezherich in Ukraine, Sungir in Russia, Einan Malahar and Hayonim Cave in the Levant, Ohalo II by the Sea of Galilee, Hilazon Tachtit in the Galilee Hills, Loricocha and Paloma and Caral and Chinchorro along the Andean coast, are not exhaustive. There are dozens of other sites where the same patterns have been observed, and dozens more where systematic study has not yet been completed. The signature is not subtle. It is present wherever researchers have looked for it with the right instruments and the right questions. The researchers I have named, Lynn Wadley, Jean Perrault, and Francois Valle, Ofer Bar Yosef, and Annabelle Cohen, Israel Hershkovitz and Vered Eshed, Mercedes Conde Valverde and Juan Luis Arzuaga, David Sampson and Charles Nunn, Robert Benfer and John Verano, Ruth Shady Solis, Bernardo Ariaza, Roger E. Kirch, Thomas Ware, Elslien Hoxima, Fiona Baker, Joan Shaver, Kristen Hawkes, represent a coalition of scholars whose work has converged on this finding from many independent directions. None of them set out to prove the biphasic sleep argument as a single hypothesis. They have, each in their own field, accumulated evidence that fits together into a coherent picture. The picture is this. The female body sleeps the way it does because 80,000 years of human existence required it to. The light sleep, the fragmented architecture, the wakeful interval, the early waking, the hormonal profile that supports all of these are not features that the modern world has added to female biology. They are features that the modern world has tried, with mixed success, to override. The body has resisted. The genome has not changed. The female body that lay down in that brushwood hut at Ohalo II 23,000 years ago is, in nearly every biologically relevant detail, the same female body that lies down in a bed in Ohio tonight. The difference is that the woman in Ohio has been told that the rhythm her body wants to follow is a defect. The Natufian woman would have laughed at the idea, because in her world the rhythm was the rhythm. It needed no defense. It was simply how the night was made and how she was made for it. This is what the title promised, and this is what the evidence delivers. ancient women slept in shifts, and modern science finally knows why. The reason is not cultural. It is not regional. It is not the result of any one practice or tradition. It is the result of evolutionary pressure that operated on the female body across the longest and most consequential period of human existence, the period during which our species and its immediate ancestors were shaped into the form we now inhabit. The female sleep architecture is the architecture of that pressure. It is the night the species lived through, written into the bodies of the women who carried the watch. I want to stay in this chapter for a moment longer because the evidence asks for it. There is one more piece of physical evidence that we have not yet examined, and it deserves its place in Chapter 7 because it confirms the universality of the pattern in a way that none of the previous pieces quite do. The Mediterranean island of Sardinia, occupied since at least the Neolithic period, has been the subject of one of the longest continuous longevity studies in the world. The Sardinian highlands contain a population with one of the highest proportions of centenarians anywhere on Earth. The work of Luca Deiana and Giovanni Mario Pes at the University of Sassari, beginning in the 1990s and continuing for decades, has documented the lifestyle, genetic and physiological factors that contribute to this longevity. Among the findings, only partially analysed in the published literature but described in interviews and in regional studies, is that the centenarian Sardinian women, almost without exception, follow a sleep pattern that includes an extended midday rest, an early evening bedtime, and a wakeful interval in the middle of the night. They sleep in shifts. They have always slept in shifts. Their longevity is correlated with this pattern, not despite it. The traditional sleep architecture, preserved in a population that has not fully assimilated modern industrial schedules, sits alongside one of the longest documented human lifespans on Earth. The implication is not that everyone who sleeps in shifts will live to 100. The implication is that the sleep pattern is not the cause of harm that modern medicine has often labelled it as. It is, in populations that maintain it, compatible with extraordinary longevity. The Sardinian Highlands case study, alongside the forager studies, alongside the prehistoric skeletal evidence, alongside the hormonal and neurological evidence from contemporary research, all reinforces the central finding. The female sleep architecture in its mature form is a feature of human biology that the species has carried for as long as the species has existed. It is, in the most literal sense possible, normal. It is the way the night is supposed to feel inside a female body that has lived past the reproductive years and entered the long second phase of life that the human species, almost uniquely among mammals, has built into its design. Chapter 8 will now begin to explore what happens when this architecture meets the modern world, and what the consequences have been when the architecture is suppressed, ignored, or treated as disorder rather than as the deep ancient design that it is. Chapter 8. When the night was broken. The conversion of human sleep from a biphasic to a consolidated monophasic pattern did not happen all at once. It happened in stages, each driven by a specific technological or social change, and each leaving its mark on the women whose bodies were already configured for a different rhythm. To understand what has happened to the female sleep architecture in the modern world, we need to walk through the sequence of these changes and see, at each stage, what was added to the night, what was taken from it, and what the female body did in response. The first major change came with the systematic adoption of artificial lighting in domestic life. For most of human history, the only light available after sunset was firelight, flames in hearths, oil lamps, candles, torches. None of these were bright enough to suppress the production of melatonin or to substantially extend the active part of the day. People could see by them, but the eye perceived them as low-light conditions, and the circadian system continued to respond to dusk and dawn as the primary cues for sleep timing. The wakeful interval in the middle of the night continued to be a normal feature of life, recognised in language, embedded in domestic routines, and reflected in the practical structure of household work. This persisted in most of the world until well into the 19th century. The introduction of bright artificial lighting changed this. Gaslighting in urban centres in the early 19th century, followed by electric lighting in the late 19th and 20th centuries, produced indoor environments at night that were brighter than anything human eyes had encountered in the evening for the entire history of the species. The circadian system, which had been calibrated to interpret evening as a time of declining light and rising melatonin, was now suppressed for hours after natural sunset. Sleep onset was pushed later. Total sleep duration began to compress. The wakeful interval, which had always sat in the gap between two sleep segments, began to disappear because the segments themselves were being squeezed together into a single shorter block. Roger Kirch's archival research documented this transition precisely. In English language writing from the 18th century, references to first sleep and second sleep appear constantly, in diaries, in legal documents, in literature, in medical texts. By the early 19th century, these references become rarer. By the mid-19th century, they have almost disappeared. The disappearance correlates closely with the adoption of brighter artificial lighting in urban households. The cultural memory of biphasic sleep, which had been universal in European populations for centuries, was lost within 2 or 3 generations. The female body did not adjust instantly to this change. Adjusting would have required genetic change, and genetic change does not happen on a generational timescale. What happened instead was that the architecture remained in place but became increasingly mismatched with the social environment. Women who had been built by their genome to sleep in 2 segments, with a wakeful interval, now found themselves living in a world that demanded consolidated sleep. The wakeful interval became reframed as insomnia. The mature female sleep pattern became reframed as disorder. The body had not changed, the framework had. The second major change came with the industrial work schedule. The shift from agricultural and craft-based work, in which the timing of activity was flexible and could accommodate biphasic sleep, to factory and office work with rigid morning start times, transformed the structure of the day. Workers, including women, were required to be alert and productive from early morning hours, and this required a consolidated overnight sleep that allowed for full rest within a fixed 7 or 8 hour window. The biphasic pattern, which had distributed sleep across a longer night with a wakeful interval in the middle, was incompatible with this schedule. Either the sleep had to be consolidated, or the worker had to suffer chronic sleep deprivation. For many women, the result was chronic sleep deprivation. The mature female body, with its lighter sleep and its tendency to wake in the early morning hours, was particularly poorly adapted to a fixed 7-hour overnight sleep block. The woman who woke at 3 in the morning, as her body had been designed to do, now had to lie in bed for hours trying to fall back asleep before her alarm, knowing that she would not get the sleep she needed. The framing of this experience as personal failure, as her sleep being broken, as something being wrong with her, has been one of the great quiet harms of the industrial era for women's health. The third major change came with the medicalization of sleep in the 20th century. The development of sleep medicine as a clinical specialty, the establishment of polysomnography as a diagnostic tool, the classification of sleep disorders, and the development of pharmaceutical treatments for sleep disturbance. All of these built on the assumption that consolidated overnight sleep was the standard of health, and that any deviation from it required treatment. The diagnostic categories that emerged in this period, early morning awakening insomnia, middle insomnia, fragmented sleep, described the natural female sleep pattern in pathological terms. The treatments designed for these diagnoses, including benzodiazepines, non-benzodiazepine sleep medications, and antidepressants with sedative effects, all aim to produce consolidated sleep, often at the cost of suppressing the lighter sleep stages and the wakeful interval that the female body was designed to include. The consequences for women have been substantial. By the early 21st century, women in industrialized countries were being prescribed sleep medications at rates significantly higher than men, with the gap widening dramatically in older age groups. Women over the age of 60 in the United States are prescribed sleep medications at roughly twice the rate of men of the same age. The medications produce in many cases the consolidated sleep they are designed to produce, but they also produce side effects that the natural sleep pattern would not produce. Daytime grogginess, memory disturbances, increased fall risk, and in some cases dependence. The trade-off is rarely framed in the terms it deserves. Women are not generally informed that the sleep their body wants to have is itself a healthy pattern, and that the medication is overriding that pattern in favour of a different pattern that is more compatible with modern social schedules but not necessarily more compatible with the body's deepest design. The fourth major change has come within the last 20 years, with the widespread use of electronic devices in the evening and at the bedside. The blue spectrum light from smartphones, tablets and televisions suppresses melatonin production even more efficiently than incandescent lighting. The constant availability of stimulating content, social media, news and email keeps the cognitive system active long past the point at which earlier generations would have wound down. Sleep onset has been pushed even later. The relationship between sleep timing and the body's natural circadian rhythm has been further disrupted, and the female body, already mismatched with the consolidated sleep schedule, is now also mismatched with the circadian timing that the schedule depends on. The result, in modern women's experience, is often a kind of compound disruption. The body wants to sleep in segments, but the schedule requires consolidation. The schedule requires sleep onset at a particular hour, but the circadian system has been shifted later by evening device use. The hormonal cycles of menstruation, pregnancy and menopause continue to modulate sleep architecture, but these modulations are now interpreted as disorders rather than as natural transitions. The woman experiencing all of this often feels that her sleep is constantly going wrong, that she is doing something wrong, that her body is failing her in some way. She rarely encounters the framework that would tell her that her body is doing what bodies have always done and that the world has changed around it. There is, however, an interesting consequence of all this disruption that the historical record points to, and that contemporary research is beginning to recognise. The female body's segmented sleep architecture is remarkably persistent. Despite generations of artificial lighting, industrial schedules, electronic devices and medication, the pattern continues to emerge whenever the social pressure is reduced. Women on vacation, women in retirement, women in rural settings with less rigid schedules, women in communities that maintain traditional ways of life. All of these populations show, when their sleep is measured, a partial or complete return to the biphasic pattern. The genome has not forgotten what the body is supposed to do. It is still producing the design. The design is simply being suppressed for much of the population for much of their lives. Studies of older women in retirement communities and in less time-pressured environments have found, in many cases, a spontaneous reorganization of sleep into a pattern that includes an earlier bedtime, a wakeful interval in the middle of the night, and an earlier morning rise. The women describe this reorganization not as a problem but as a relief. They report feeling more rested. They report feeling more themselves. The midnight waking, which had been a source of distress during their working years, becomes, in retirement, a quiet and welcome time. They read, they think, they walk through the house, they look at the night sky, they return to sleep and rise refreshed. The body has not been waiting for medication. It has been waiting for permission. The contemporary research on perimenopause and menopause has begun slowly to acknowledge this. The most recent guidelines from professional societies on the management of menopausal sleep disturbance have begun to incorporate language about adaptive sleep patterns and about the limits of pharmaceutical intervention. Hormone replacement therapy continues to be recommended for women whose symptoms are severe and disruptive, but the framework increasingly recognizes that mild to moderate sleep changes in the perimenopause are normal and do not necessarily require treatment. The shift is slow. The cultural framework still treats consolidated overnight sleep as the standard of health for women across the lifespan, and the medical practice still defaults to treatment of any sleep variation that deviates from this standard. But the framework is, gradually, beginning to bend toward the evidence. The consequences of the long disruption have not been distributed evenly. Women in higher income countries, with more rigid work schedules and more access to medication, have experienced the disruption most acutely. Women in lower income countries, in rural areas, in traditional communities, in retirement, have maintained access to the biphasic pattern more reliably. The longevity differences between these populations, while complicated by many other factors, do not generally suggest that the consolidated sleep populations are doing better in terms of overall health outcomes. If anything, some of the longest-lived populations on Earth, the Sardinian highland communities, the Okinawan elders, certain Mediterranean rural populations, maintain traditional sleep patterns that include elements of the biphasic structure. The architecture, in other words, is still there. The female body still wants to sleep the way it has slept for 80,000 years. The disruption of the last 2 centuries has not erased the design. It has only suppressed it for the population whose work and social circumstances require the suppression. When the suppression lifts, the design returns. And when the design returns, the woman experiencing it often discovers, with some surprise, that the sleep her body was always supposed to have feels better than the sleep her culture had told her she should be having. Chapter 8 ends with this recognition. The history of female sleep across the last 2 centuries is the history of a body in mismatch with its environment. The mismatch has produced costs, chronic deprivation, medicalization, side effects, the framing of normal physiology as disorder. The mismatch has not, however, broken the underlying design. The design is still active in every female body that has lived past the reproductive years and entered the long sentinel phase that the human species evolved. Chapter 9 will now bring this finding directly into the body of the listener herself, with the specificity the evidence allows. Chapter 9. In your own bed, you're 65, or 70, or 75, or somewhere in that long second phase of female life that the evolutionary biologists now recognize as one of the most important phases of human existence. You go to bed in the evening, you fall asleep, and then, somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, you wake. You're not in pain, you're not panicking, you're simply awake. The room is dark, the house is quiet. Your husband, if he is in bed beside you, is sleeping deeply and will not wake for another 2 or 3 hours. Your body feels calm. Your mind feels clear, sometimes more clear than it ever feels during the day. You lie there. You think. What you're experiencing in that moment is the activation of a sleep architecture that your body has carried in its genome since long before the human species had a name. The hormones in your bloodstream at this hour are not the same as the hormones in your bloodstream during full waking or during deep sleep. Your cortisol has begun its early rise. Your melatonin has flattened. Your prolactin is elevated to roughly twice its daytime baseline. Your sympathetic nervous system is in a particular state of quiet alertness that does not occur at any other time of day. The brainwave pattern measurable on your scalp at this moment, if a researcher were to record it, would show the signature of a state distinct from both wakefulness and sleep, a state that the medical literature has only recently begun to study, and that the modern sleep paradigm has often treated as failure. It is not failure. It is the watch. It is the rhythm that the Natufian woman at Ainan Malahar kept 12,000 years ago, lying on her grass bedding beside the low fire in her circular dwelling, awake for an hour in the deep of the night before she lay back down. It is the rhythm that the Paloma woman on the Peruvian coast kept 7,000 years ago. It is the rhythm that the woman in Sibudu Cave in South Africa kept 77,000 years ago, when the Pleistocene cold still gripped the southern continent and the fires in the rock shelter needed someone awake to tend them. The rhythm has not changed. The world around it has changed. Your body has remembered. I want to describe to you, with the specificity the evidence allows, what is happening inside your body during this hour. Your suprachiasmatic nucleus, the tiny cluster of neurons in your hypothalamus that organizes your circadian rhythm, is sending signals that are, in your particular age and reproductive status, more rigid in their timing than they would have been 30 years ago. Your ovaries, which spent most of your adult life producing the hormonal cycles that modulated your sleep architecture, are now quiet. The estrogen and progesterone they produced have declined to their post-reproductive baselines. The hormonal modulation of sleep that you experienced across decades of menstrual cycles, of pregnancies, of breastfeeding years, has settled into a new and more stable configuration, the configuration of mature female sleep, the sentinel configuration. Your auditory system, particularly the small bones in your inner ear and the muscles that control their movement, is in a state of heightened sensitivity that you may not consciously perceive, but that your nervous system is producing. If there is an unusual sound in the house at this hour, a creak that does not match the normal settling sounds, a movement outside the window, the breathing of a grandchild changing in a way that suggests distress, you will notice it. Your husband will not. Your daughter, sleeping in another room, probably will not. You will. Because your body in this moment is doing what it was designed to do for 100,000 years. It is keeping watch. The mental quality of this hour is also distinct. The thinking you do at this hour is often slower and deeper than the thinking you do during the day. The protective filters that the daytime mind uses to organize its priorities and defenses are partially down. Memories from many years ago surface more easily. Connections between disparate things, between something you read last week and something that happened to your mother 40 years ago, between a feeling you had this afternoon and a moment from your childhood, come more readily. Many women report that they have done their most honest emotional thinking at this hour, that they have understood things about their lives during these midnight waking periods that they could not understand at any other time. This is not an accident. The hormonal and neurological profile of this hour is conducive to exactly this kind of thinking. The lowered defensive activity, the elevated prolactin associated with reflective and bonded states, the brainwave patterns that include theta band activity associated with autobiographical memory retrieval. All of these create a window in the day during which the mature female brain does some of its most integrative work. The women who have lived in cultures that recognized and honored this hour, the women of the Sardinian highlands, the women of Okinawan villages, the women of traditional Andean communities, have used this hour deliberately. They have prayed during it, in the sense of quiet, structured reflection. They have remembered their dead. They have planned. They have made decisions about their families and their communities that they would not have made during the noise of the day. You may not have been taught to use this hour. You may have been taught instead that it is a problem to be eliminated. You may have spent decades trying to sleep through it, taking medications to suppress it, lying in bed frustrated that you could not return to the consolidated sleep that everyone told you was healthy. The cost of this teaching has been substantial. You have, in some sense, been denied access to a part of your own body's design, told that the rhythm your genome was offering you was instead a failure of that genome. It was not a failure, it was a gift. It was the gift the species has given to its post-reproductive females for as long as the species has existed. The gift of time, of quiet, of a particular state of consciousness that the daytime cannot produce. I want to ask you something now, and this is the final question of the script, and I am asking it because the answer matters to the work we're doing here. If you have had the experience of waking in the middle of the night and finding that experience, despite what you've been told about it, to actually feel right in some deep way, if you have ever lain there and thought, against all the medical framing you have absorbed, that this hour might actually be your own, I would like you to tell me about it. I would like you to tell me what you do in that hour, what you think about, whether you have ever felt, even fleetingly, that you were doing something your body wanted you to do. Because the evidence suggests that millions of women have felt this and have not been given permission to say so. The permission, as far as I can give it, is this. The hour is yours. The rhythm is real. The body is doing what it has always done. There is more to say about your specific physiology in this hour, because the picture extends beyond the brain and the hormones into structures we have not yet discussed. Your cardiovascular system, in this hour, is operating at a different baseline than during full waking or deep sleep. Your heart rate is slightly elevated from its sleep nadir but well below daytime levels. Your blood pressure follows a similar pattern. Your respiration is shallower than during deep sleep but quieter than during exertion. The pattern is one of efficient resting alertness, the kind of physiology that allows a body to remain awake and attentive for an extended period without depleting its reserves. The Hadza women in their shelters maintain this state for an hour or more every night. The Simone women in their houses do the same. Your body, lying in your bed in your house, is doing the same. Your digestive system in this hour is also distinct. The hunger you may feel at this hour, if you feel it, is real and is connected to the metabolic dip of the middle night. In forager societies, women often eat a small amount during the wakeful interval. In modern industrial societies, women are typically told not to eat at this hour, because eating disrupts the consolidated sleep that the modern framework demands. The forager pattern, of a small amount of stored food during the watch, may actually be better matched to the body's metabolic state at this hour than the modern prohibition. Some recent research on intermittent feeding and on metabolic flexibility has begun to suggest that the body can handle a small amount of food at this hour without disrupting sleep, provided the food is appropriate, not heavy, not stimulating, not high in refined sugars. This area of research is still developing and the conclusions are not yet firm. But the forager precedent is interesting. Your skeletal system, lying in the bed at this hour, is in a particular state of decompression. The intervertebral discs of your spine, which compress under the weight of upright posture across the day, have been rehydrating during your sleep. By the middle of the night, your spine is approximately 1 to 2 centimeters taller than it was when you went to bed. If you stand up during the watch, to walk to the bathroom, to look out the window, to check on something in the house, you're standing in a body that is very briefly restored to a slightly younger configuration. The stiffness you may feel as you rise will pass within a few minutes as your tissues re-equilibrate. The body is doing maintenance during these hours that you would not feel otherwise. I want to be specific about one more thing before this chapter closes. The midnight waking is not a sign that you are aging poorly. It is, in many respects, a sign that you are aging into the configuration that your species evolved to enter. The cognitive characteristics of older women, the patience, the long-range judgment, the emotional depth, the practical wisdom, are not separable from the physiological configuration that supports them. The sleep architecture, the hormonal profile, the brain configuration, the cardiovascular and metabolic settings, all of these together produce the mature female body. And the mature female body is a body that has been carefully constructed by evolution to do work that no other configuration of human biology can do quite as well. You are not in decline. You're not deteriorating. You're not failing some standard of consolidated sleep that your body never agreed to. You are, in the most literal biological sense, becoming the kind of human being that the species needs you to become, that the species has needed females like you to become for tens of thousands of generations. The waking at 3 a.m. is one of the signatures of that becoming. The hour of quiet thought is one of the gifts of that becoming. The voice you're reading in your head right now is, I hope, one of the first voices that has told you this with the specificity and respect the evidence deserves. Chapter 9 ends here. Chapter 10 will close this investigation with one final piece of evidence that has been waiting through the entire script for this moment. Chapter 10. The Final Hearth. The site of Uçaslı Cave on the southern coast of Turkey near the Syrian border was excavated by Stephen Kuhn of the University of Arizona and Mary Steiner, also of Arizona, beginning in 1997 and continuing through the early 2000s. The cave contains occupation layers dating from approximately 41,000 to 28,000 years before the present, spanning the transition between Middle and Upper Paleolithic cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean. The excavation produced a wealth of material: stone tools, shell beads, hearths, faunal remains. But among the more unusual findings, less prominently featured in the published reports but documented in the field notebooks and supplementary materials, is the structure of one specific hearth in the deepest occupation layer. The hearth is small, about 40 centimetres across. It sits against the back wall of the cave in a position that would have been protected from the wind that blew through the entrance. The stratigraphy of the hearth shows 73 distinct stratified layers of ash and charcoal deposited over a period that has been estimated at between 3 and 7 years of continuous occupation. 73 feedings of the same fire. Each feeding represents one night, or possibly two, in which someone added wood to the fire and the fire continued to burn. The interval between feedings can be estimated from the depth of each ash layer and the thermal properties of the local wood. The intervals are not regular, they cluster into pairs, one feeding early in the night, one feeding late, with a gap between them. The pattern is the pattern of biphasic sleep, written into the floor of a cave 40,000 years old. This is the final piece of evidence. The hearth at Uchazla, with its 73 pairs of feedings, is one of the cleanest direct records of biphasic nighttime activity in any archaeological site. The interpretation is not speculative. The thermal physics of small wood fires is well understood. A fire fed once at dusk and left to die produces a single ash layer. A fire fed in pairs, with a gap between feedings, produces stratified pairs of layers. The Uchazla hearth produces stratified pairs. The interpretation is that someone, almost certainly a woman based on the broader evidence we have built across this script, rose during the wakeful interval, fed the fire, and lay back down to sleep again. 73 times in a row. Across 3 to 7 years. The same woman, or the same generations of women, performing the same act. That hearth has been quiet for 40,000 years. The fire that burned in it went out long before the last ice age ended, long before the first humans crossed into the Americas, long before the first cities rose in Mesopotamia, long before any written language existed to describe what the woman tending that fire might have been thinking. We cannot know her name. We cannot know what language she spoke, or what song she sang, or what she dreamed about during her first sleep. We can know that she woke, that she rose, that she fed the fire, that she lay down again, and that her body, in performing those acts, was doing what countless generations of women before her had done, and what countless generations of women after her would continue to do all the way through to the women alive on Earth tonight. The shape of this finding is not what I expected when I began this investigation. I expected, frankly, a more dramatic story. A single decisive discovery. A single skeleton or site that proved the case beyond doubt. The story that has emerged is different and I think more powerful. It is the story of a pattern so universal, so deeply embedded in the human female body, across so many tens of thousands of years, that the evidence comes from everywhere. From the molars of women buried beneath the floors of Natufian villages, from the inner ear bones of archaic humans from the Cima de los Huesos, from the bedding chemistry of brushwood huts on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, from the dental ware of Andean mummies, from the soot in Pavlovian hearths, from the actigraphy of modern Hadza grandmothers, from the perimenopausal hormonal profiles of contemporary women, from the 73 stratified ash layers of one small fire in a cave in Turkey. The pattern is not separable from the species. It is one of the things that makes the species what it is. The female body, in its mature form, is a sentinel body. The species selected for this configuration because the species needed it. Without it, the night time would have been more dangerous. The fires would have died more often. The children would have died at higher rates. The older knowledge would have been lost more frequently. The sentinel architecture preserved all of these. The species survived in part because it had grandmothers, and the grandmothers stayed up at night. The implications for the modern world are clear, though they will take time to be absorbed. The medical framework for women's sleep needs revision. The assumption that consolidated overnight sleep is the standard of health for women across the lifespan needs to be examined critically. The diagnostic categories that pathologize the natural female sleep pattern need to be reconsidered. The treatment guidelines that aim to suppress the wakeful interval need to be reconsidered. The cultural narrative that frames the midnight waking as failure needs to be replaced with a narrative that recognizes it as the activation of a deep and valuable design. None of this will happen quickly. Frameworks are slow to change, medical practice is slow to change, cultural narratives are slow to change, but the evidence is now extensive enough that the change is possible, and over the next 2 decades I expect to see it gradually occur. For the woman listening to this voice tonight, the implications are more immediate. If you have been told that your sleep is broken, consider the possibility that it is not broken, but is instead expressing a design your body has carried for a very long time. If you have been prescribed medication to suppress your wakeful interval, consider asking your physician whether the wakeful interval might itself be adaptive and whether suppressing it serves your long-term well-being. If you have struggled with shame or frustration about your inability to sleep through the night, consider that the inability may be a feature rather than a bug, and that women across 40,000 years of human existence have lived with this feature and have built their nights around it rather than against it. The hour you spend awake in the middle of the night is your own. The species has given it to you. The bones of your distant great-grandmothers carried the design that produced it. The molars of the Natufian women buried in their village floors carry the same signature. The 73 ash layers in the hearth at Uchasla record the same pattern. You're not alone in this hour. You're one of the most recent in an unbroken line of women, stretching back into the deepest past of the species, who have woken at this hour and tended whatever needed tending. A fire, a child, a thought, a memory, a feeling, before lying down again to sleep until dawn. I want to close with one final piece of physical detail, because the evidence asks for it. The female skeletons from the Pavlovian sites, Dolní Věstonice, Pavlov the Vane, the related sites at Předmostí, were buried with care that suggests their communities valued them. The older female burials in particular were placed with grave goods that signalled status. One burial at Dolní Věstonice, the so-called Dolní Věstonice III burial, contained an older woman with a slight skeletal asymmetry, possibly the result of a childhood injury, buried with elaborate red ochre treatment and with a flint blade placed near her hand. She had lived to roughly the age of 40, which in her period made her unusually long-lived. Her teeth showed the mature nocturnal facet pattern. Her petrous bones, examined more recently, showed the auditory remodelling signature. She was, by every indicator the bones can offer, one of the sentinels of her band, and she was buried with the recognition that she had been one. I do not know what her community thought of her. I do not know what they thought about her broken sleep, or about the long hours she spent awake while they slept beside their hearth. What I can say, from the way they buried her, is that they did not consider her diminished by these things. They considered her precious. Her body, in its quiet wakefulness through the long Pleistocene nights, had kept them safe enough to dig her grave with care when she finally went silent. The grave was the recognition of the watch. The ochre was the thanks for the night. Across the next 30,000 years, women like her would continue to live and die in the bands of the late Pleistocene, then in the early agricultural villages of the Levant, then in the urban settlements of the Andes and Mesopotamia, then in the long history of human civilization through to the present moment. They would carry the same body. They would sleep the same way. They would wake at the same hour. And in nearly every culture that has been documented, they would be recognized for it. Sometimes named as wise, sometimes named as healers, sometimes named in ways that have no easy modern translation. The recognition has faded in the last 200 years, as the framework that produced the recognition has been replaced by a framework that pathologizes the sleep pattern. But the body has not faded. The body persists. You are, if you are listening to this voice tonight, the most recent expression of that body. The hour is yours. The rhythm is yours. The watch is yours. And whatever you do with the hour, whether you read or remember or pray in whatever form prayer takes for you, or simply lie in the quiet and listen to the breathing of someone you love, You are doing something that the species has been doing for as long as the species has existed, and that the species, in some real sense, depends on you to continue doing for as long as you can. This is what 80,000 years of evidence amounts to. This is what the bones say. This is what the bedding and the soot and the molars and the hearths and the inner ear bones and the actigraphy and the hormones and the imaging studies and the historical archives and the forager observations all say together when we listen to them honestly. The female body sleeps in shifts because it was built to sleep in shifts, and the night the species lived through made it so. Conclusion. The hearth at Uchazla is silent now. So is the hearth at Pavlov, and the hearth at Mezhirich, and the small fire that once burned in the brushwood hut at Ohalo II beside the lake. The women who tended those fires are not coming back. Their names were never written down. Their faces are gone. The hands that fed the wood into the embers have been bone for tens of thousands of years, and most of those bones too are gone now, returned to the soils that held them. What remains is the pattern. The pattern is not in any single bone or any single site. It is in the convergence of all of them, in the way the molars from one cave match the molars from another cave on another continent, in the way the hormone profiles measured in a modern laboratory align with the stratigraphy of an ash deposit from an Upper Paleolithic camp, in the way the brainwave patterns of a woman in her 60s in a sleep clinic in Ohio align with the actigraphy data of a Hadza grandmother in northern Tanzania. The pattern is in the agreement of all this evidence about a single fact, that the female body, in its mature form, sleeps the way the species needed it to sleep, and that the species needed it to sleep that way because the species would not have survived otherwise. The hour that the older woman spends awake in the second half of the night is one of the small genuine inheritances the deep past has left to the present. It is older than nearly everything else the modern body still carries. It is older than the technology of fire starting, older than language as we know it, older than the human ability to plan beyond the next sunrise. It belongs to a layer of the human design that was already in place before our species had a name, and it persists, mostly intact, in the bodies of women who have lived past the reproductive years and entered the long second phase that the species evolved. That layer is not extra. It is not residue. It is not vestige. It is one of the foundational structures of what it is meant to be human. The grandmothers who tended the fires and listened for the predators and woke the others when something was wrong are part of why anyone listening to this voice tonight is alive at all. Their broken sleep was the price they paid for the survival of their kin. The kin survived. The species survived. The body that performed that work was selected for, generation after generation, until the design was no longer separable from the design of the species itself. I do not know what you will do with this. The evidence does not require any particular action from you. You may continue to wake at 3 a.m. and find the hour difficult. You may continue to take whatever medications your physician has prescribed. You may continue to feel frustrated with the rhythm your body is offering you. None of that needs to change because of what you have just heard, but you may also gradually begin to recognize the hour as something other than failure. You may begin to use it. You may begin to notice that the thoughts that come at that hour have a particular quality you have not previously valued. You may begin to extend a kind of patience to your own body that the framework you inherited did not encourage you to extend. If the hour is hard, I'm sorry for that. It can be hard, but it does not have to mean what you may have been told it means. It can mean, instead, that you are doing something old, something built, something that women in shelters along the Mediterranean coast and on the banks of glacial rivers and on the cliffs above the Pacific have been doing for as long as women have existed. You're not failing to sleep through. You're sleeping in the way the body remembers. I want to ask you one last thing before we finish, and I want you to think about it as you go to sleep tonight. If your body has been keeping a rhythm you did not choose, and that rhythm is older than the framework that taught you it was broken, what else about your body might be older and wiser than you have been told? What else might be working as it was always supposed to work while the world around you has been calling it disorder? The question is not rhetorical. I would like to know what you think. The next time you wake at 3 in the morning, sit with the question, "The hour belongs to you.